Gordon is the Florence Kelly Professor of History and the University Professor of the Humanities at NYU. She's also a very good friend and colleague. This is a full introduction. Her books, articles, and awards are so numerous that we need into the time we have with her to name them all. All the work she's done concerns central issues of social life and change in America. From her account of the history of birth control in the United States, the definitive history of birth control politics in America, to her most recent biography of the great photographer Dorothy Alline, A Life Beyond Limits, which won the LA Times Book Award, the Bancroft Prize in American History, her second, which is very unusual, and the National Arts Club Prize. The titles of her books alone tell the story of her scholarly activism, and I wanted to stress that. I mean, there is a life of activism in scholarship, as well as being an activist, in addition to being a scholar. Her history of welfare in the United States, Pity, Single Mothers and the History of Welfare, won the Berkshire Prize and the Gustavus Myers Human Rights Award. The book Heroes of Their Own Lives, The History and Politics of Family Violence, won the Joan Kelly Prize of the American Historical Association. She got her first Bancroft for the Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, a powerful account of vigilante action against Mexican Americans. And of course, she co-edited the anthology you've all read for today, Dear Sisters. Linda.
Thank you. Before, we're talking about a women's movement that developed in the late 1960s and continued through the 70s. Before I start, I want to ask you, why did there need to be a women's movement? What did women have to complain about in, say, 1960? Do you know? They could vote, right? They could attend universities. What? Yeah.
Some of the things where there's housing discrimination, educational discrimination, women prejudice.
Okay, when you said educational discrimination, what was the first kind of discrimination you said?
Housing.
Interesting. I'm not sure about housing discrimination. Do you have were you thinking of something in particular? Because you may know something I hadn't thought of.
I just said in one of the readings.
Okay. Maybe I even wrote it myself and forgot what I wrote. What else did people have to complain about?
Women didn't have say over their own bodies, and the fact that men got to decide what they did.
Good. Did you hear that in the back? He was talking about lack of control over your own bodies and the way doctors treated women very disrespectfully. A woman in a golden shirt, yeah.
They were completely objectified, especially when he left. The men didn't really respect any women within SDS.
Yeah, curious. Read some stuff, yeah.
Any women who wanted to enter the workplace were prejudiced against. So not just a glass ceiling, but a brick one, basically.
A lot of discrimination in the workplace. Let me just tell you a few others, because I think people sometimes forget. If you were a woman who was charged with a crime, you could easily have a jury of all men. There was not until the very late 60s that the courts ruled that it was discriminatory to simply reject all women on juries. If you wanted a credit card and you were a married woman, you probably had to have your husband's signature. And that would have been true about making large purchases, that you had to have your husband's signature. Athletics? I don't know how many of you are in that world, but in the world in which I went to school, universities and colleges spent basically all their athletic money on the guys. Very puny support, if any, for women who wanted to play on teams or even just wanted to do what I think is called recreational sports. Professions. Women were professionals in big numbers in what you would call today the lower professions. They were social workers. They were elementary school teachers. Many, many fewer were high school teachers. That was considered a man's job. Law and medicine were overwhelmingly male. Women often were in law school, with numbers like 3 women and 300 men. There were tremendous complaints that women had about divorce policy. In fact, in my youth, I was asked by a friend to go and testify that her husband had beat her, that I had seen it. It was a lie, but it was what she had to do to get a divorce. In that state, at that time, he could get a divorce if she was unfaithful. She could not get a divorce if he was unfaithful. She had to come up with something worse than that to get a divorce. Luckily, they settled and I did not have to lie under oath, which I would have done it, actually, because it was the thing that was done. You may know that the birth control pill was put on the market in 1960, but for that whole decade, you couldn't get birth control from a doctor or a clinic, even Planned Parenthood, if you weren't married. So women basically constantly had to lie and say they were engaged, or even borrow a ring and say they were already married in order to get birth control. Men, of course, as you know, could get condoms in any drugstore. I could go on. But I think one of the things you need to understand is that not all, in fact very little, of what the women's movement was complaining about were actually the laws, as opposed to the practices. Right? You can have all kinds of laws on the books, but if people's informal practices aren't respectful of women, people felt angry and upset. How much of Dear Sisters did people read? Do you want to remind me what?
They read the introduction and the sort of selections that we gave from the pieces.
But select, yeah, and I chose them, but I haven't remembered.
I should have sent them to you, so.
It's all right, it's all right. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the process of the development of this women's movement. And then, but keep that short, because I want to spend a lot of time talking about the issues and the new, you might say, analyses, the new theoretical contributions of the women's movement to understanding the world around them. And just to introduce that before I go into the history, let me point out that the women's movement invented, you might say, 2 new words that really did not exist in common usage before. And I would wager to say that one of them is known by absolutely everyone in the United States today, and that is the word sexism, right? You may not agree with its implications, but you know what it means if someone says that was a sexist remark, right? The other one is a word that had been used in science for quite some time, but with a very restricted and different meaning, and that was the word gender. And my guess is that it's not completely as widely understood, but that most certainly college students have got this idea that there's a difference between sex and gender. The idea that sex is something that is physical about your body that you're born with. Gender is something that you're socialized into. We'll talk more about what that means, but it seems to me that a really interesting way to look at a powerful social movement like this is to look at the way in which it develops new concepts and new ideas, which often become new words, which are then spread throughout the country. And a very analogy, of course, is the way the civil rights movement invented the word racism, which did not exist before that word. People said race prejudice or race discrimination, but now there's a simple word that encapsulates all that. Okay, the movement. The mother of the women's movement was the civil rights movement. And there's a very interesting precedent for that in American history. You're probably aware that there was what is sometimes called a first wave women's movement, which some people think of as the women's suffrage movement, but that's really not right, because suffrage, the right to vote, was only one of their demands. It's really better called the women's rights movement because they were campaigning for the women to have the right to attend higher education, the right to work, the right to own their own property, etc. That movement was also born of a civil rights movement. In that case, that civil rights movement was the movement to abolish slavery, abolition, it's called. And in both cases, the first case, which happened in the 1840s, and the second case, which happened in the 1960s, 120 years later, a very similar dynamic happened. In the abolition movement, there were a disproportionate number of women who were very strong opponents of slavery and who began to speak out very strongly, to go into the meetings of abolitionists, to actually give public lectures, to speak in churches and so on. Within the abolitionist movement, there were some, you might call them gender conservatives, who thought it was improper for women to speak in public. They used to quote, I think it's Paul, who said something like women should be seen and not heard. They thought it was unwomanly for a woman to stand up in front of a group and make a public speech. The women who were doing that did it because they were so passionate against slavery, but the fact that they were attacked for playing that public role forced them to defend their rights as women to participate in public. And it's quite interesting to say, well, what if they had never had that conservative attack? Would there have been a women's movement? I think there would have been, but it may not have developed as quickly or as soon. Well, some very, very similar things happened in this, what we call the second wave in the civil rights movement. Very many women participated in the civil rights movement, were extremely passionate in wanting to contribute to destroying the absolute apartheid, the total segregation of the southern part of the United States, in which African Americans were deprived of every legal right there is, literally. But there were all kinds of barriers that they felt that they were experiencing toward being able to speak up, to assume leadership roles. It's not that there was a direct attack that said women shouldn't be seen in public, but there were all kinds of much more subtle ways in which the women ended up being the people who made the coffee, cleaned the offices, mimeographed the leaflets. You got to think of a primitive time before there was photocopying, where there were these machines that you went like this, and for every copy you had to stand there and do this. They were the ones that did the typing. They were not the ones that made the public speeches, went to visit their congresspeople, etc. And so in a way, what happens is that women, feeling that discrimination within that movement, they didn't relinquish at all their commitment to civil rights, but they began to think, we need to get together as women to start to talk about our own problems. That continued through a next large movement, and that was the movement against the Vietnam War. It's a very interesting contrast to the wars we have today, and it's often difficult to speak about that Vietnam War to people who didn't live through it, and I know you've talked a lot about it, but the point I'm making here is there was a huge movement which toward the end of the war, the majority of American people were extremely strongly against the war. And in that movement too, women were actually disproportionately numerous among people who were active in that movement, but almost completely excluded from the leadership. And again, find themselves relegated to the same jobs. It's really important to understand that continuum of social movements, because the women who began the women's liberation movement had been part of these movements that were saying we need to create a real democracy, a democracy in which everyone has equal rights and an equal right to participate. And the rhetoric and the principles, the very idealistic principles of democracy in America were principles that they then took to heart and began to apply for the first time to themselves. But they had a really different kind of problem or need than, for example, considering African Americans in the civil rights movement. You could ask absolutely any African American who lived in the South, from probably the age of 3 to the age of 93, if they were discriminated against. And if you asked them that, they would look at you like you were an idiot. You know, of course we're discriminated against. We can't vote, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't serve on juries, we can't be treated fairly. Every African American knew that they were discriminated against. They didn't have to be taught that. That wasn't the case with women, because women had, in a way, been much more effectively taught from very, very early on that women were just destined for a certain role in life. And that was the role of being a mother, being someone who took care of the house. That was so strong, that sense of that role, that it was very true. And actually, I have to say it's still true among a lot of people now. I'm glad it's changing, that even if you have a married couple in which both the man and the woman go out of the home and work for wages or a salary for 8 to 10 hours a day, right? So they're both equal in contributing money. But then when they come home, it's expected that the woman does everything else. She does all the cleaning, she does all the cooking, she washes all the dishes, she takes care of the kids, she changes their diapers. And there were actually a million studies that showed that women, on average, would get 3 to 4 less hours of sleep per night than men. And you can understand why. That problem has since been given a name. It's called the double day. And what's interesting about it is that you might say it made sense that women would do that work if the man was the only one earning the wages. Once both people were earning the wages, that didn't make a lot of sense anymore, and yet it was so ingrained. I think people they didn't think that men were capable of changing a diaper. So it was very ingrained in women, which is a really important point here. When we talk about a gender system, and by that I mean things like this division of labor, understanding who's responsible for what, it's part of women's minds as well as men's minds. This is not a thing in which men are simply dumping work on women that they don't want to have to do. I could give you many other examples of ways in which women were simply not aware of the way they've been discriminated against. And I can tell you frankly that it was absolutely true of me. I sort of think that when I was in college and graduate school, I didn't even really register that I was a woman. I don't mean that literally, but you understand what I mean in a certain larger sense. When I was in graduate school, I was surrounded by male graduate students who were carefully groomed and mentored by their advisor. I would notice that they would get invited to go out to dinner with visiting speakers, and I would not. They would be, even though my grades were just as high and my papers were just as good, but there was this kind of, I called it benign neglect. People weren't rude to me, they just didn't take me seriously. And if you called them on it, they would say, and I've heard people say this, well, but you're just going to get married and have children, so we don't really need to spend time helping you toward a career. So there were a million ways that women were part of an existing gender system, and in that gender system it was understood that women had certain definite roles that were not as public, that were not as remunerative, et cetera, et cetera. And so the task of this women's movement was different, because it had to focus on what came to be called consciousness raising, which was beginning to, in a way, unlearn what we had been taught since we were infants about the role of women. And they did this through the invention of a very, very new organizing technique that was very different from anything that had been done before. And these were the kind of spontaneous creation of very small little discussion groups, which could range from 5 people to 15. And they were all a little different because this was a completely decentralized movement which completely swept the country. And it swept the country in a way it, quote, went viral, as we say today, but there was no internet, right? So it's actually a little mysterious to see how quickly just word of mouth spreads. And I can tell you a personal anecdote. In Boston, where I was living at the time, I was part of a little discussion group like that, and more people kept saying, oh, I want to join your group, oh, I want to join your group, but we felt that if our group got too big, we couldn't have the kind of personal discussions we wanted to have, so we decided that we would help them form their own groups. And so we put an ad in the paper and said, a kind of local weekly, not a big paper, and said, you know, if you're interested in a women's liberation discussion group, come to such and such a meeting at 7 o'clock at night. And 100 women showed up. And so we did it again a week later, and 150 women showed up. I am not kidding. It was like everybody wanted to do this. In these groups, what was going on, they were not book club groups, they were not reading groups, they were not support groups in which people just made nice to each other, although people did do that, but they were discussions in which people talked about their own personal experience in a lot of ways and then found out how many other people shared it. Some of it was very personal and very physical. The classic example is, why do, you know, I just feel like I'm so overweight and I can't lose weight. Women tend to be obsessed with this. And then you would go around the room and you would find out that 80% of the other people in the room, also everybody felt like they were too fat. And so then there's our discussion, why do we all feel like we're too fat? Who made up this ideal body, which is the body that we are all supposed to have? And you began to see that what you thought was your own personal problem was actually something larger and something not just coming out of your own situation, but something constructed socially. Why is it that my husband will always take out the garbage, but if I ask him to wash the dishes, it's really hard to get him to do it, and when he does it, he leaves them half dirty, so I have to do them again. We started to call that the politics of housework, a very good way of getting out of doing housework. If you ever don't want to do it, is do it poorly, so that someone else will have to do it after you, right? I don't even know that guys were doing this consciously. I think it may have been partly unconscious, but we discovered, hey, this was going on a lot. And some of the discussions were really private, in which women talked about not enjoying sex very much. And then people began to look at how they were actually having sex and the ways in which the sexual acts themselves had been traditionally designed. I don't know if you know the phrase missionary position, that may be a phrase of my generation, defining a certain kind of sex which is aimed at male satisfaction and not at female satisfaction. One of the things that came out of this kind of discussion, I wish I'd thought to bring a copy. How many of you have ever heard of the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves? Just a few. Well, this was first published as a little small 75-cent pamphlet in Boston, basically about teaching women about their own bodies. And if you saw it now, you'd sort of say, you know, but it really shocked people because it had, not photographs, but accurate medical type line drawings of people's bodies, including their genitals, discussions of sex, discussions of orgasm, discussions of all kinds of things, discussions about the whole process of childbirth. At least in my mother's generation, when you had a baby, when you got to a point where you went into labor, they would take you to the hospital, they would knock you out, and when you woke up, there was a baby. And you had no experience of the childbirth itself. And it was the women's movement a lot that began to push for educated childbirth, what they call prepared childbirth, and which gave rise to the home birth movement, which is a significant thing. But when this book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, came out, it was refused by a lot of libraries because it was considered indecent. it actually became, over many, many iterations, many revisions, it became one of the biggest bestsellers in the world. It's been translated into 24 languages. It's sort of like your basic sort of sex education, but at a college or adult level, not at a lower student level. One of the things that started it was, in one group, this protest about the way doctors treated women. It was extremely common in those days that if you were a married woman and you had something life-threatening wrong with you, let us suppose that you had cancer, the doctor might well decide in many cases not to tell you because they would think it would be just too upsetting and you wouldn't be able to bear it, and they would tell your husband what was wrong with you and let him break the news to you. They were treating you essentially in many ways like a child. There was no sense that you should have any say over your own treatment. Breast cancer was literally a word that you would normally not say in public. To have breast cancer was practically like being, I don't know, like being shamed in some way. Like saying that you know, like calling someone a slut, but well, not really, but you understand what I'm saying. You just didn't discuss those things openly. And one of the things that was discovered is that when you looked at the priorities of the National Institutes of Health and the people that do health-related research, that those two were extremely discriminatory. And it took a huge women's movement campaign to get them to prioritize research about breast cancer. These things didn't just happen. They happened because of these kinds of struggles. And it was these consciousness-raising groups, more than anything else, that gave rise to the particular campaigns about particular issues. On the other hand, the women's movement never created, this women's movement anyway, never created lasting national organizations. There was one, and there still is one national organization. It's called the NOW, National Organization for Women. It's very important, incidentally, that you should understand that it's organization for women, not of women, because men are welcomed as members of the NOW. It's anybody who believes in women's rights. But at that time, NOW focused exclusively on one area of discrimination, and that was employment discrimination, which is very important, obviously. But it was not everything. And NOW was organized earlier. It began to arise in 1962, whereas the younger women's movement only really appeared in 1968, maybe 6 years later. The younger women's movement, which was usually called the Women's Liberation Movement, brought into the public also a whole range of issues that were really new to the public. For example, rape. In most states of the United States, you have to remember that the U.S. is very complicated because it's a federal system, and most of kind of criminal law is generally done by the states, and so there can be a huge variation. Family law too, like divorce and marriage law. But for example, to prove that someone had raped you, you really had to show actual signs of physical force. You had to show that the person was armed, or you had to show that you were wounded, you had to show bruises, and so on. There was no such thing as what we would call marital rape. If you were married to a guy, he had the right to sex with you whether you consented or not. Because in most understandings of marriage, that was part of the law of marriage, that you were supposed to supply services to your husband, and those services included sexual services. One of the things that the women's movement did is they invented the crime of marital rape and changed the law so that people now understand that marriage is not a license to rape. Similarly, another whole new concept, which is date rape. Generally speaking, what rape at this time was assumed to be that you're walking down the street and some complete stranger grabs you and drags you into an alley. what we now know is that that is a very, very small minority of the kinds of rapes that occur. The whole question of what constitutes coercion. The women's movement invented another crime called sexual harassment. If you went down the street and people grabbed at your body, that was something you were just expected to put up with. People didn't understand even what was being talked about when women started talking about sexual harassment and saying this should be criminalized. To some extent, it could be said, and I would agree, that this women's movement in some ways, or parts of this women's movement, went overboard in being extremely so suspicious of sexual harassment. Some people argue that they criminalized flirtation, right? Just sort of flirting with people. I was teaching a class right here the other day, and I asked women if, when men say hi, pretty, or something to you on the street, but say something rather than touch you, if any of them ever received it as a compliment. And one woman was brave enough to say, well, yeah, this guy said such and such to me, and I thought he was just giving me a compliment, and I felt good about it. And what I'm saying about that is it's a very complicated area here, right? And it's not easy to define it, and so I think there was some justice in claiming that people went too far. There were huge controversies about male professors, and they were virtually all male. I never had a woman professor in my whole life. That when male professors went out with women students. And I think that a lot of universities absolutely ban that if you're going out with your own student, right? I don't even know what the rule is here. Does anybody know what the NYU rule about that is?
I think
That's the rule.
What?
That's the rule.
That's the rule.
You can't take your current students.
Your current student.
And throw
But
last students on.
right, some people would argue. Well, you see, it's complicated, as Marilyn showed you. I actually know women who have been, several women who have been in couples, like forever, like 50 years, who were married to their former professors. And some people would argue, well, again, we're just trying to criminalize or control behavior too much. Two particular issues really divided the women's movement, and they're very interesting issues to think about. One is prostitution. There are many people who are feminists and also people who are anti-feminists who think that prostitution is inherently depraved and that anytime you're selling sex for money, that is degrading and very bad for your psyche as well as for your body. There are other people who say, well, women have to earn a living, and this is one way of earning a living, and sometimes you can earn a better living doing this than you can standing at a cash register in Walmart. And it should be a person's right to do that if they want to. There was never any resolution of that issue. The other issue that divided the women's movement very badly was pornography. Some people feel that pornography inherently degrades women. Now, this is very complicated and gotten more complicated since, because the coming out in a big way of the gay movement means there's lots of gay men's pornography in which there are no women. There is some lesbian pornography in which there are only women. And also it gets even more complicated because a lot of heterosexual guys like to look at lesbian pornography. I mean, it's, my own view is that human sex is just so mysterious and complicated we cannot possibly try to figure it out. But there are other people who would say there is nothing wrong with material that is designed to create sexual arousal. Why is that bad? Provided that no one is coerced and that no one is hurt in the manufacture of this material. But there was a very, very strong anti-pornography movement, and one of the very odd twists in this is that some groups of people who were part of the women's movement made alliances with people who were extremely against the women's movement, with kind of Christian right-wing traditionalists, to propose municipal regulations banning pornography altogether. I believe that none of them won, and I believe that in the case that any of them won, it was declared unconstitutional on grounds of free speech. The fact that there was no major organization meant that you have a movement that is practically as various as the women who were in it, right? You just cannot, it's very, very difficult to generalize about what all these literally hundreds of thousands of consciousness-raising groups were doing. They did have some things in common. One is that, and this I say without any doubt that it's true, that everyone loved being a part of them. People just, they never missed a meeting. They felt so kind of gripped by hearing other people's stories and being able to use those stories as a basis of thinking about the larger programs. Another generalization you can make was the absolute confidentiality rule, that people felt free to say very personal things because they had total confidence that this was not going to go outside this room, right? You could badmouth your boyfriend, you could badmouth your sister, and it wasn't going to come back to bite you. In quite a number of groups, this was the first place where women came out as lesbians, because it was such a safe place that you felt like you weren't going to be judged. And this was a time when many women were really shocked to think about other women being in love with other women. It was not as, there's been an enormous change in people's attitudes about homosexuality since then. But beyond that, there's very little commonality among these women's groups. Some were small, some were large, some went on for years and years and years. Some are still going. Others dissolved after a while. But what you really had was the way in which lots of little separate groups nevertheless made a universal consciousness change. I would argue there is not a single woman alive in America whose feelings and thoughts and life has not been in some way changed by that women's movement, even if she never heard anything about it. Someone coined the term post-feminism, and it's often misused, but it's very characteristic of your generation, men and women, and that is that you have grown up in a world that you expect, by and large, much more respectful treatment of women than did my generation. And you take for granted certain things that women are allowed to do, like be very strong and play competitive sports and be lawyers and physicians and college professors, as well as being the single mothers that we have so many of. Another fact that you need to cope with, just on the question of single mothers before I leave this, how many of the women here expect to be a lone mother? Well, guess what? 50% of you will be. In fact, it's more than 50% now. A majority of all American women will end up at some years of your life being the household head with children, because your relationships or your partnerships will break up, or because you never wanted to have a partnership with a man. Those are the facts. I mean, it may not be true of 50% of people in this room, you understand. I'm giving you an aggregate of U.S. history, historical figures, but it's a very important thing to think about, and you will be so much in a better position to handle that than would be my generation. largely because you're college students and because of the earning power that once we get out of this depression, God willing, you will have. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about the ideas of the women's movement, because there's not a lot of time. And in my mental list, I have 8 of the major new ideas. And the first one, of course, is gender. I already said that. And that is the notion that what it means to be female is something that you are in complicated ways taught from the moment you were born. People show all the time that the way people respond, even to tiny infants, is really different when they know they're female or male. Once, when I was at the time of this movement, I had an acquaintance who had a child, and she decided, as a matter of principle, that she wasn't going to tell anyone what sex this child was, this baby. And she would wheel him around, and I'd see her in the neighborhood. She wasn't a close friend. It was really difficult because if you don't call it he or she, you have to call it it. And that's not an appropriate way to address a human being in our language, right? And she gave it up after about 6 months. She just couldn't do it. It was just impossible. This gendering starts so early. And the second part of this attitude about gender that people often miss is that it also involved a rethinking of what was masculinity. And the discovery that a lot of guys actually felt very, very oppressed and kind of constricted by the requirements of, quote, be a man. Don't cry, you're a man, right? Only sissies cry. In fact, I think in looking at masculinity, I think that there is a weapon that gets used against men all the time that is one of the most powerful psychological weapons, and it isn't symmetrical. You don't have that kind of weapon against women, and that is the calling of a man a coward. I think that's what armies thrive on, is that men are really terrified to be considered cowards. It's fundamentally kind of undoes your self-esteem. I don't think women have that kind of problem with being called cowards. And also, to call someone unfeminine, you're unladylike anyway. Now it just doesn't have that kind of, I don't think women are as frightened of that label as men are of being called unmanly, yeah.
I would almost say calling it someone who has a child a bad mother would be
Yes,
better for this in line.
I think that's right. The mother thing is very heavy for women. A bad mother is really a terrible thing to be called. Whereas a bad father doesn't have the same. However, there's one other thing I want to say about gender because it's much more complicated now. At the time of the women's movement in the 1970s, people believed, I think pretty clearly, that the only thing that was fixed about our sex was our physical bodies, right? And that everything else was socially constructed. But it's gotten more complicated, particularly as a result of neurological brain research. Because there are these questions of endocrines and hormones. You know, it's very complicated because everyone, male and female, has testosterone, and everyone, male and female, has estrogen. And same with many other hormones, and there are big differences in the amount, but there are also differences among men and differences among women. And it is now appearing that it may well be that there are either electrical circuits or, you know, I'm no physician, so I speak about this very crudely, or chemicals in our bodies that also affect things about our behavior. In fact, the borderline between gender and sex is nowhere near as clear as it used to be. And it raises a lot of interesting problems. How many people here have ever heard of Caster Semenya? You have, the runner. Yeah. She's a South African champion runner, very young, and she was challenged in a recent, I think, Olympics. If you know the story, if I'm getting it wrong. some other kind of
Yeah,
tech
it's
guy.
just- I think it's
She was challenged about whether she's, quote, really a woman, because she's very muscular, she's tall, she just is very, very, very big muscled, you might say. And so, in a process that I think was extremely humiliating for this woman, they forced her to undergo these blood tests in which they were looking for various kinds of endocrines and hormones. In other words, they put the burden on her somehow to prove that she was a woman, right? And that's very troubling to me. She had women's genitals. She was raised as a woman. Everybody treated her as a woman. So that seems wrong. But on the other hand, think about the point of view of the other women who were competing with her and losing and saying, oh, this woman, you know, maybe she takes steroids or something. I mean, she was, I think, cleared of taking drugs. Is that?
Yeah. The problem was that it was like she was born kind of not entirely set, or she couldn't fit into either category.
Well, this is the fundamental problem, which is actually becoming much more something that you're aware of now, because we have transgender and transsexual people, and we know that even sex isn't fixed. You can change your sex. You can not only resist your gender socialization, and so we're actually in a very interesting period in terms of thinking about what are the connections between gender and sex, and they are complicated. But it is important to understand that at the time of the women's movement 40 years ago, people didn't have those kind of doubts. And everybody was sure that if you raised your little girl and your little boy in exactly the same way, that they would end up being very similar, and then they were surprised when it didn't turn out to be true. You know, I mean, when more of you have kids, I don't know how many of you have kids, you will see that having kids changes your minds about a lot of things about gender. Okay, the next big idea. I'm keeping watch of the time here. There's a distinction between sexism and male dominance, or male supremacy. Sexism is an attitude. Sexism is when, you know, a guy doesn't really take seriously the things you say. He, you know, trivializes them. Male supremacy or male dominance is not the attitude of a person. It is the attitude, and it's not an attitude at all. It is a structure of the society that men cannot escape any more than women. You know, a report just came out about how, in which for the first time they're actually controlling for what jobs people have, and they show that in every job category, women earn less than men. Now, you know, suppose me and a guy are taking new jobs and he's offered, you know, $5,000 a year more than me. Well, what can he do about that? If he turns that job down or says, no, I only want to get paid what she gets, I mean, right? That's not sexism. That is something that is built into the organization of the society that men cannot always do. I mean, if for example, most universities these days, I don't know if you're aware of this, do practice affirmative action for men, because women tend to have higher grades in high school. And if you just did it by grades, there would be too much the domination of women. Well, since that's something in which guys benefit, should they just say, well, no, I won't accept admission because I know you're discriminating in my favor? It's not the individual man's problem. And I think this was extremely important to this women's movement, that this is not a campaign against individual men. It's a campaign against the way things are organized. And that's why you have so many men who are feminists and who actually support these things, because it's a sense of, you know, common justice. The third idea is not really an idea, but it was a so-called discovery. And that was the actual physiology of female sexual response. You know, it's hard to believe, but so-called scientific textbooks for centuries taught things about women's bodies that were absolutely not true. 170 years ago, the medical textbooks said that women weren't really asexual, that they didn't have sexual drive or sexual feelings. And in fact, one of the dominant theories about in the Victorian period, or the period of the mid-19th century, was that the reason women get into sex at all is only because they want to be mothers. It's the maternal instinct that makes them interested in sex. And otherwise, they would be absolutely and furthermore, one consequence of that was that people literally did not imagine that two women could be sexual together. Because what would they do? And if women were so asexual, and furthermore, sexual activity is thought of as intercourse and only intercourse. So the fact that women were, through publications like Our Bodies, Ourselves, actually coming up with what now is accepted as the truth and forcing people to confront a very different view of women's sexuality was another of these important ideas. And along with it, point number 4 on my list of ideas was what you might call the rejection of expert opinion and a kind of anti-authoritarian attitude toward experts. Because we have been raised, I was certainly raised, that when a doctor told you something, you absolutely trusted it, you didn't question it. When a teacher told you something, you trusted it, you didn't question it. And also in my day, the faculty, it's different today. The faculty that I had in college and graduate school were far, far more conservative than they are today in every respect. What they taught you about American history and patriotism and wars and just everything was just a lot more conservative, and we were socialized to respect that. And that's still true in a lot of parts of the world. I actually last semester I had the experience of teaching for 7 weeks in Abu Dhabi, where I had students from all over the world, but mostly from other Muslim countries. And their education, a lot, was still about memorizing. That's what they were expected to do, to memorize what they were told and then to have a test in which you were required to repeat it back. And it took them a while to catch on to a more American style of education in which questioning things was actually considered a good thing to do in most classrooms, I hope. That was a big paradigm shift for people in the women's movement. To be able to say to a doctor, no, I don't want that kind of treatment, or please explain to me in detail what you're telling me is wrong with me. These were really very radical ideas, and some of them were taken to, I don't want to say extremes, but were taken further than others. One of my favorite examples was a project called Jane, and you'll understand why it was called Jane in a minute. It came out of an abortion clinic when, this is before Roe v. Wade, when abortion was still illegal and you had thousands and thousands of women. This was in Chicago, and so you basically probably had thousands of women having abortions every day illegally, and they worked at a kind of somewhat underground clinic, and they were being trained as helpers to the physician who was doing the abortions, and once he was ill and couldn't show up, and they decided to do it themselves. And they discovered, which actually midwives had known for centuries and centuries and centuries, that abortions are not complicated, and that someone who is meticulously clean and very careful can do an abortion, which was done in those days simply by scraping gently the inside. This is before vacuum aspiration abortions, just scraping gently the inside of the uterus. And after that, they just started doing this regularly, and they did this until Roe v. Wade, and never had an accident. There's a whole book about Jane, and the reason it was called Jane is because, of course, in the days of illegality, you couldn't call up someone, you got a number from a friend, and you couldn't call up and say on the phone, I want an abortion. You learned a code, and the code was, I'd like to speak to Jane. And so that's why they called it Jane. But there were a lot of things like this that were going on in which people were trying to figure out themselves. Another very, very big movement was, which has influenced every one of you, was the movement toward eating healthily and trying to get rid of foods that were heavy in chemicals, trying to eat more fresh foods, all of that. Very, very much health conscious thing came very, very strongly out of the women's movement, and relatedly out of the environmentalist movement, which was also very strong in that period and had a lot of women. Okay, the idea number 5 is one I've already touched on, but just to mention it as an idea, is the idea that so-called sexual freedom may not be an unmixed blessing, and that you need to look carefully at sexual freedom. You need to think about whether there are ways that women can be exploited just as badly by the idea that they ought to be into having sex casually, just as exploited by that as they were by the idea that they should never enjoy sex. It's very much fed into the side of feminism that was really hostile to pornography, saying that all of this material just intensifies the attitude of treating women as sexual objects. Right? People began advancing something, I don't know how much this has taken off, but you know, in my day, dating meant that girls were passive and you just sat and waited for a boy to call you and invite you on a date. I don't know how much that's still true, it may be, but in those days people were like, well, let's us call the boys. Why do we have to sit around and wait for them to call us, right? Why don't we take control? Dating in those days also meant that the guys always had to pay for everything. They had to pay for dinner, they had to pay for a movie, they had to pay to buy you a corsage if you went to the dance, which thankfully I only did once in my life. It was miserable. I don't know, I had to wear a strapless dress, I was afraid it would fall down. Anyway, but there was, you know, and I don't know about practices now, but my impression is that there's much more of an assumption that people share the cost of everything, and you don't automatically expect a guy to pay for everything, but maybe that's not true. But certainly there's a different attitude about the passivity of women in relation to future romantic relations. But along with that came, and this is idea, what I call idea number 6, and that is a new attitude about relations among women. In my day, now this didn't happen to me because I wasn't in that network in high school, but in my day in high school or college, if you had planned to go to the movies with your girlfriend or on Saturday night, and then a boy called you up and invited you out on a, quote, date, it was just understood that you dropped your girlfriend in a minute and automatically went out with the guy. There was just this attitude that dating is a form of courtship. It's expected to lead to marriage, and it's very important. It's kind of like work. It's something that you do, you know. It's expected of you, whereas women friends are sort of there in the background. Well, you know, in a way that was always false, because one of the things we know historically is that women have always relied intensively on very close friendships among women. That's been, and men too among men, but like more so among women. And that's been, you know, as early in civilization as we have evidence, that's been the case. And it also was particularly the case around major life events. You know, when you were having a child in a traditional society, before there were hospitals and doctors, what you have is a group of women who were experienced, who would all come and be there with you. And if you were lucky, you had your mother and your sisters, but you also might have aunts and cousins and neighbors, and they were there not just to help the child be born, but to take care of your house while you were laid up, and to take care of your other kids, and to feed you and clean you. And if someone was sick, it was women who gathered around and nursed them. If someone was dying, it was women who gathered around. So this is always true, but I think what the women's movement was doing is saying, let's recognize this. Women are very important in our lives. And here's another interesting fact. Most women today are going to have longer relationships with women friends than they are with male partners, because the divorce rate is high. And these are people that you may well be hanging out with when you're 70 or when you're 80 and your husband is dead, or whatever. It's a woman who would have been a nicer person if she had been born later, because I think she was frustrated because she was a smart woman who never got a college education and never could achieve what she had the capacity to achieve. And I think that can make people irritable and bitter and angry. So people were rethinking that and thinking in a more charitable way toward parents that they might have had a lot of conflict with. And also about their fathers, because they were thinking about the way in which he was constrained by norms of masculinity. Then, idea number 7, which is hugely important, was the birth of an open lesbianism, which certainly was related to that, but not exclusively a part of that. I mean, there have always been women who loved other women sexually. And actually, in some ways, people have argued that in the 19th century it was easier for them. Because since nobody believed that women could do anything together that was sexual, they were just free. I can tell you all kinds of stories about so many historical couples of women who people just thought were sort of roommates. And I think they were actually romantic and sexual partners. A woman most voted once the most admired woman in America, Jane Addams, was a lesbian who lived always with her partner and was always treated they were always treated as a couple by their friends, but other people just didn't want to recognize this for what it was. In some ways, the fact that lesbian got thought of in a new way as a part of this phenomenon called gayness or homosexuality for a while was making it harder, because you couldn't hide as easily. But on the other hand, that flowed into this very, very powerful gay rights movement. And just to say a word about that, one of these interesting examples of the way that unanticipated events really shape social movements. In terms of the gay movement, what I'm thinking about is AIDS, of course, which was terrifying, right? When the AIDS epidemic first came out in the early 1980s, and in this way it's not different from earlier venereal diseases like syphilis. There was a time when syphilis had no cure either, but now it's this disease that didn't have a cure and didn't at first even have a way to control it. And it produced then a really powerful movement, both to force people to do research about AIDS, but also against discrimination, because the first response to AIDS was, oh my God, I don't want anybody in the same room. I don't want to touch anybody who has AIDS. And so you had to really re-educate people. And of course, then you had the Christian right saying, well, this is just God's punishment for sin, that these people are sick. Well, that movement, even though it was mainly a movement of men about a disease that mainly affected men, was nevertheless joined in a very big way by lesbians and by other straight people too, in supporting people and fighting the discrimination. And I actually think, ironically, that it helped combat the fear and discrimination of homosexuality that a lot of people had. But then finally, number 8, and then I realized I just rattled on too long, but a new understanding of what the family is, which goes along, obviously, with with understanding gay and lesbian people. So we now have lots of families that are 2 women and children, and a rapidly increasing number of families who are 2 men and their children. But it's not just gay people. It's the enormous number of what are called blended families, right? People get divorced, they get remarried, they have children from both marriages. People get into all kinds of complicated family relations. And I think what the women's movement is saying is there is no one right form of family. All right, that family that describes certain kinds of relations in which people both provide emotional support and take responsibility for people. Family is the place where if you're really sick, they're going to take care of you, right? So, it's very complicated to try to define it, but I do think that very much owing to the women's movement and some of the things around it, people have opened up the concept of family. And one of the phrases I've always hated, though it's still widely used, is this notion of broken family when they talk about people who've been divorced, because I don't think you necessarily break a family. In fact, one of the other things about the women's movement, and then I'll stop, is the issue of joint custody in case of divorce, which is now the norm, right? Judges assume that if a couple get divorced, that unless there's a good reason not to, there should be joint custody of the children. And it's by far better for children than to suddenly lose a parent, especially if it's a responsible and loving parent. So I wanted to stop earlier, but a lot of changes. But if any of you have questions or comments, arguments, or anything.
Do you think the fact that we take a lot of what the women's movement accomplished for granted as women has actually weakened its progress?
That's a really interesting question. I actually do, because not just the women's movement, but I think it's also true about the civil rights movement and other movements, because I think when you forget that change doesn't just happen, but that people have to get together and fight for it, it's a way of weakening people's commitment to do that again when they see something else that's wrong. They just sort of assume, oh well, either that's just the way it is, a kind of passive thing, or this other kind of passive thing, oh well, that'll change gradually and there's nothing I can do about it. Yeah. So that's true, but it's not only about the women's movement, it's about all social movements for change.
I was wondering if this is a ninth idea or a subset of one you already talked about, which is the way that we think about meetings and the conduct of discourse. Like I was thinking about how before the women's second wave was got really up and around during the free speech movement, when like Bettina Affleck or some female actors would try to speak, and the men would either not let them speak or not take what they said seriously, or there would be no formal structure, like the Joe Freeman's thing about the tyranny of structure. Right. It seems like this consciousness about the way that we interact in meetings on gendered basis is another innovation. Just at the conference the other day, I noticed with the Occupy activists that they had this phrase called, what was it called, pulling back or something? I think it was usually when the guys wouldn't shut up, that the women would say something like, pull back. Yeah. And they would pull back and then the woman would be able to speak. So it seems like that's another sort of almost, and the other thing I want to say is that it seemed like at the time, the way Bettina talked about it, they didn't really have a word for it. They didn't have a language to understand what they wanted. They knew it was frustrating and wrong, but it was almost like the women's movement invented a way to make sense of this.
It's true, but unfortunately, there's a huge difference between small meetings and large meetings. I think most teachers know this, and I don't know if any of you are going to be teachers, that, you get shy people to speak up more if you put them in a small group, right? But one of the things that people in the women's movement discovered is there's a big difference between women and men in large groups. And one of the reasons was, and I'm afraid still is, that women who stand up in a large group are much more self-conscious. And they feel that everybody is staring at them and that their appearance and their sound and everything has to be appropriate. And men wonderfully don't have so much of that self-consciousness. And that's very hard to combat. And, it's still true that women spend, on the whole, more time trying to look nice than men do. And they do it not just for men, but for other women, too. It's part of a thing about a very great self-consciousness about the way you look, the way you sound. So the women's movement became very conscious of these things, but they also found that in large meetings, even if it's a huge meeting of just women, that you're going to have this problem that some people dominate, and they talk more, and they're more confident, and they're more articulate, and they just somehow more forceful in a way that can make other people back off and feel more passive, and that they can't. So that it is a problem that's worse probably between men and women, but it doesn't go away when there's just women. And that's one of the reasons that, sort of democracy is so hard, because people aren't equal in their, and why, in fact, a lot of people gravitate toward a really charismatic person, and there's great value in, think about what the civil rights movement might have been like if there hadn't been Martin Luther King, with that kind of extraordinary eloquence. That was a gift to everyone else, but it also did, in fact, have the result of making some people back off and feel like, I'll just do whatever he says is right to do. So I think it's just something that you have to constantly combat in meetings. Any other thoughts or anything? Yeah.
I'm not even sure how to articulate this question, but how do you think that the women's movement is working with like immigrant families? Like my family comes from Iran, and I feel like they're still very much in this like pre-60s like mentality of like women are just supposed to get married and like maybe come to college for like an MRS degree, but like that's it, and like all that matters is who you marry and like what you're into. And I mean, like, how long do you think it's going to take to like break the barrier of like immigrant society?
Really interesting question she asked about the women's movement. Did you hear it in back? Yeah, you did hear it. I don't need to repeat it. Well, there's two things I would say that are related, though they may not be related in your particular case. One is about immigrants, and the other is about poor and working class people. Let me do the second first. There's a myth that's really wrong, that the women's movement was only a movement of very elite women. And in fact, there were tons of projects that were aimed to better the employment and living situations of people who don't have a lot of money. And some of them were one and some of them were not one. The issue about immigrants is very complicated, because, at least the point that you raised about different, you might say, family and gender standards and practices. On the one hand, people who have an orientation of women's rights think that there really needs to be equality, and that it is wrong to subordinate women and require that they do certain things, or limit them from doing certain things that men are free to do. But on the other hand, people also feel, as I do, that you have to have a certain respect for cultural differences and not assume that our way is the one and only way that things should happen. Those things can conflict. When I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, in my daughter's high school, there was a friend of mine was an ESL teacher at that school, and there were a lot of Hmong people. Do you know who the Hmong are? H-M-O-N-G, a kind of a mountain people from Indochina who were resettled. And the people that, what's that great Clint Eastwood movie? Gran Torino, if you've ever seen it, it's a great film. Anyway, well, the Hmong have a practice of arranged marriage, and they also have a practice of very young marriage. And this girl, who was a freshman in high school, went to the ESL teacher and said, well, my parents have to say I have to leave high school after this year to go get married. And the teacher said, and the girl said, I don't want to get married, I want to stay in high school. And the teacher said, well, that's right, you should be able to stay in high school. But then there was this official commissioner of Hmong affairs for the city of Madison who said, no, you have to respect the family's authority. Well, that case is easy, because in the United States it is not legal. In Wisconsin, it's not legal to get married if you're 13, and secondly, it's not legal to ever have to get married if you don't want to get married. So that case is easy, but there would be other cases that are not so easy. And here's another example. This one is much more drastic than anything we're talking about, and I realize I'm over time, but just to finish this. In parts of Africa, in Egypt, in Kenya, and Somalia, there's a widespread practice of what's called female genital surgery. I'm sure some of you will have heard about this. And at one point, some American feminists went into a huge campaign to abolish this. And you can understand why. But the result of that is that for many people who are very observant of the practice, including women, this is just another case of American imperialists coming in and telling us we have to stop our traditional practices. And one lesson that I hope people have drawn from that is that that practice is going to be stopped by feminists from within those countries who are campaigning against that. In Egypt, in Kenya, there's actually a wonderful film about this, if you ever want to see it, which is about a very graphic film, but it's about the women campaigning against it. So there's no simple answer how you can both respect people's culture and stand up for your rights, although it's a little different when these are people like you who actually live in the United States. Then I think it's reasonable to expect that they obey the laws of the United States. Anyway, I'm sorry I went on. Thank you. Thanks so much.